Hello, everyone. I think I'll wait a minute or two, but I just want to ask the panelists if you would like me. It's just so great to see you. Hello, Paulina. Hello,
Hello.
Demet. Nice to meet you. Hello. Hi, Ashley. Great to see you again and great to see everyone. I'd like to ask you, hello, Marielle. Wow, really great. Okay. I'd like to know if you would prefer if I introduce you all at the same time, or if you would like me to introduce you just before you give your paper. Do you have preferences there?
I'm fine with both options.
Okay.
Yeah, me too, as long as
Okay.
you can remember.
Okay. I've noticed that sometimes there is space in between the papers. Would you like a minute in between each paper just to kind of stand up and stretch? Okay. All right. And then then Marielle, great to see you again. We'll handle the discussion part, and but of course we'll all be participating. All right, and there's Adriana. All right. So I guess I'll wait a minute. I know I was in an earlier discussion that kind of spilled over a bit. So we can wait another minute or so. Demet, where in Turkey are you from?
I'm from Tunceli, from the eastern Turkey, but I live in Istanbul.
Okay.
And work in a different city, so it's complicated.
Yeah. It was great to be back there for a short while. Look at the program. Okay. All right. If you'd like to, we can get started. So welcome everybody to Woolf and European Context. So I'm serving as the chair and Marielle O'Neill is serving as the chat moderator. So I will introduce the panelist and then we'll take about a minute or so in between each presentation to just stretch, reflect, and then carry on. And we'll hold the questions till the end. All right. So our first presenter is J. Ashley Foster, who is Assistant Professor of 20th and 21st Century British Literature with emphasis in Digital Humanities at California State University, Fresno. She has just been awarded early tenure and promotion, yay, effective August 20th. Foster's work traces the relationships among literary, artistic, and activist networks of the long 20th century. She has published in the Woolf Studies Annual, Radical Teacher, the Handbook to the Bloomsbury Group, and was lead curator of the Digital Humanities and Special Collections exhibition, Surveying Utopias, a Critical Exploration, and lead editor of its catalog, which was published by the press at California State University, Fresno in 2019. All right. Dr. Demet Karabulut-Dede is a faculty member at Munzur University English Language and Literature Department, Turkey. She finished her postdoctoral visiting fellowship in the English department at the University of Exeter. Her postdoctoral project focused on time-space compression in the works of Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Richardson, and James Joyce. She gained her PhD from the English Language and Literature Department at Ankara University, where she also worked as a research assistant. Her PhD dissertation was a comparative analysis of the works of Virginia Woolf and Arnold Bennett in terms of space and gender. Paulina Pająk, PhD, works at the University of Wroclaw, I never quite say that correctly, Institute of English Studies, Faculty of Letters. Excuse me. Her research focuses on interwar culture and modernist literature, memory in Virginia Woolf's works, Bloomsbury Group, Transnational Publishing Networks, and Modernist Legacies in Contemporary Literature. She has co-edited the Edinburgh Companion to Virginia Woolf and Contemporary Global Literature, published in 2021. And that was quite an effort, as we can attest to. Her recent, because I was part of that project too, her recent publications include articles and chapters in Virginia Woolf and Heritage, Woolf Studies Annual, Virginia Woolf and the World of Books, and Women's History Review. So welcome. We'll start with Ashley.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining, and I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay, can you see only the slideshow and not the cat behind the slideshow on the background of the computer?
Only the slideshow, no cat.
Thank you. Okay, that means I'm just showing the application. Perfect. I'll go ahead and just get started. Virginia Woolf, Ethical Responses to Total War and Images of Peace. Much scholarly conversation from Jessica Berman to Jeanne Mills to Jane Marcus to Rebecca Weiser and many more have noted the two sets of photographs that Virginia Woolf invokes in Three Guineas. One set is the photographs that she publishes in the text of Patriarchal Men in Power. The other set of photographs are mentioned but never shown. Those photographs from the Spanish Civil War of, quote, dead bodies and ruined houses, end quote, that the narrator of Three Guineas receives in the mail. This quote unquote gesture of refusal, as Jessica Berman calls it, is, according to Marcus, fundamental to Woolf's pacifism. That showing the photographs, the images of the scenes of war, could cause men to enlist and take up arms against fascism. And so Woolf shows those responsible instead of the incendiary deeds done. The act of total war, where civilians become military targets, seen in the bombings of Guernica, Barcelona, and Madrid, along with the rise in European fascism and the Italian 1934 attack on Abyssinia, Ethiopia, called for the question from an international community of activists during the Spanish Civil War: what is an ethical response to total war? Here I demonstrate an interrelationship between modernism, pacifism, and war, an interrelationship that holds a space open for a reading of ethics and a reading of peace. This interrelationship unfolds through a shared language that can be deciphered through the mass media, print journalism, and propaganda, as well as in pamphlets, posters, novels, poems, and the performing and visual arts of the era. The inclusion of Spanish Civil War pacifism in modernist studies stages an intervention in the dominant narrative of the employment of total war, that the only way to respond is militaristically. Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas offers an entrance into a, Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas offers an entrance into a constellation of ethical quandaries that writers who went to the Spanish front, including Langston Hughes, encountered. Numerous poets flocked to the Spanish trenches under the auspices of journalism, writing and recording eyewitness testimonies from the front that abandoned journalistic protocol and, as Jessica Berman, David Deacon, and Rowena Kennedy Epstein have all observed, adopted a hybrid literary genre that was an experimental collapse of journalism into literature, as boundaries were blurred between memoir and history, between the short story and the political pamphlet, between news and poetry. The proliferation and consistency of these texts indicate that the format of the newspaper article became an insufficient medium with which to write about the events in Spain, and that they could only witness their experience through a modernist, experimental, generically hybrid lens. My intervention here is to read the messages of peace embedded into this modernist generic hybridity. To do so, I turn to the photographs in Three Guineas as an introduction to the ethical issues the Spanish Civil War presented to pacifism. I then consider how the generic hybridity of Langston Hughes's journalism and poetry from the Spanish Civil War, when read through the critical frame of peace journalism, figures as one of the many possible responses to Woolf's call, and close with the way Hughes and Woolf are in anti-fascist conversation, which informs their pacifism. Written in an epistolary form, Three Guineas offers, quote, a bridge which connects the private house with the world of public life, end quote. In addition to serving, as Marcus has said, quote, a communist manifesto for women, end quote, it also, according to Vera Navarro, quote, bears witness to historical trauma for the sake of collective trauma, end quote. One of the traumas the text bears witness to is the large-scale employment of total war during the Spanish Civil War, where civilians become military targets. The quote unquote pictures of dead bodies and ruined houses that appear as a refrain throughout Three Guineas speak to civilian deaths, bombings of civilian houses, where the lives of women and children are on the line. The famous passage of Three Guineas, which describes the photographs in such heartbreaking detail, quote, they are photographs of dead bodies for the most part. This morning's collection contains the photograph of what might be a man's body or a woman's. It is so mutilated that it might, on the other hand, be the body of a pig. But those certainly are dead children, and that undoubtedly is the section of a house. Speaks to the ethical impossibility presented by the first fully technologized total war. In an experimental gesture, one that contributes to Three Guineas' modernist aesthetics, Woolf invokes the pictures from the Spanish Civil War so that her readers conjure mental images while reading the text. And yet Woolf refuses to print the violent pictures of dead bodies and ruined houses, and instead publishes photographs of men in power, men who would have perpetuated the war-making system. In this way, the Spanish Civil War photographs haunt the text, silhouetting the words we read and the pictures that are there. This uncomfortable trace invites thinking through the problem: what is an ethical response to total war? Woolf explores the ambivalence of the reaction the photograph can inspire in the opening pages of Three Guineas, where she stages a dialogue between the we of the educated man's daughter and a male lawyer letter writer who asks her, quote, how in your opinion are we to prevent war, end quote. The photographs inspire the inner reaction, she says, quote, war is an abomination, a barbarity, war must be stopped, end quote. Woolf writes, quote, when we look at those photographs, some fusion takes place within us. However different the education, the traditions behind us, our sensations are the same, and they are violent. And the same words rise to our lips. War, you say, is an abomination, a barbarity. War must be stopped at whatever cost. And we echo your words. War is an abomination, a barbarity. War must be stopped, end quote. However, notice how in the repetition of the man's phrase, the daughter of the educated man refuses to repeat all of the words. Yes, the daughter of an educated man avers, quote, war is an abomination, war must be stopped. But she shows her declaration of solidarity will only go so far as she omits the phrase at whatever cost. War must be stopped, cries the educated man's daughter, but not at whatever cost, not at the cost of more lives, of more war. Woolf's first letter, addressed to an educated man who is attempting to prevent war, traces the difference of mind that education has instilled between men and women. Quote, to fight has always been the man's habit, not the woman's, end quote, Woolf observes. Then when she addresses the you of the above passage, she is referring to Sir, the lawyer who is asking her opinion. When she says we, she is speaking from the perspective of the educated man's daughter. The educated man's daughter may echo the educated man's words, war is an abomination, a barbarity, war must be stopped. The words, in fact, may be the same. But what Susan Sontag misses in her critique of Woolf in regarding the pain of others is that though the words are the same, the tone is different. The cry for peace that Woolf issues with the words of the daughters of educated men, war is an abomination, a barbarity, war must be stopped, is echoed in Langston Hughes's war correspondence and poetry from the Spanish Civil War. Hughes may not offer one definitive answer to the question of how to go about stopping war, but he does cast light on images of peace. It may seem on the outset a fallacious argument to state that we can read Hughes as a pacifist, for he supported the Spanish Republic in the fight against Franco and soldiers in the Second World War in the fight against Hitler. Because my argument is cut from a longer book project, I do not have time and space to develop the full explanation here, but let it suffice to say that part of the scope of my scholarship is to advocate for a weakened version of the term pacifism, as Paul Saint-Amour has done with modernism, and in the process expand our concepts of what counts as pacifist. In this argument, the emphasis on positive peace, which Jeanne Mills and Grace Brockington have both written about in terms of Woolf and Bloomsbury, promotes the creation of a world which can sustain and support peace. Viewing pacifism on a continuum instead of an absolute scale in the mode of peace theorist Wayne Cady allows for those who engage in peace work through their actions and writing to be considered as contributing to the pacifist cause of imagining what it would take to create a world without war. Hughes's call for peace sounds explicitly through the 1941 poem, I Dream a World, where he writes, I dream a world where man, no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace its paths adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth and every man is free, where wretchedness will hang its head and joy like a pearl attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream my world. Hughes's poetry, especially read against his Spanish Civil War writings, shows that a positive peace is predicated upon anti-racism, anti-fascism, and anti-colonialism. When his journalism is cross-read with his poetry, we can see the seeds of peace Hughes plants, making him one of the forebearers to the new field of peace journalism. According to Stephen Youngblood, peace journalism does not openly advocate for peace, end quote. It does, quote, give peacemakers a proportionate voice and allow them to closely scrutinize claims made by those who advocate violence, end quote. Peace journalism's emphasis on using choices to, quote, frame stories and carefully choose which words are used, end quote, to, quote, create an atmosphere conducive to peace without compromising the basic principles of good journalism. It is proactive, humanizes the other side, gives voice to everyday people, and discusses solutions, end quote. It confronts and redirects propaganda by, quote, verifying government claims, propaganda, seeking facts from multiple sources, offering counter narratives, end quote. Peace journalism, as John Galtung has written, is ensconced in the active creation of positive peace that seeks to unearth, examine, contextualize, and analyze the causes of systematic violence, and, quote, consists of conditions where justice, equity, harmony can flourish, end quote. Peace journalists, quote, spotlight individuals and initiatives that seek these harmonious conditions and lead constructive public dialogues about issues that pertain to justice and equity, end quote. The poet Langston Hughes spent 6 months in Spain as a journalist and wrote a series of 14 articles for the Baltimore Afro-American. These articles as a collection offer firsthand narrative accounts, document Hughes's travels throughout Spain, and speak to his experience of encountering the Spanish people and society. A survey of Hughes's Spanish Civil War reportage demonstrates the way in which Hughes offers counter narratives to the standardized discourse, highlights people of color to create, a, quote, constructive public dialogues about issues that pertain to justice and equity, end quote, shows sympathy for the Moroccan soldiers drafted into Franco's army, speaks to the creation of an anti-racist society, and seeks to contextualize and analyze the circumstances of the violence in Spain. Hughes additionally constructs a spirit based on an internationalism that promotes democracy, education, and equity, and puts Spain in a global context of struggles for peace and freedom. In doing so, he writes in a modernist, experimental, hybrid genre that places his own experience as a central frame of the event, acknowledging himself as eyewitness and contextualizing his own subject positioning. Hughes's first article from Madrid, Hughes Bombed in Spain, starts out with his travel from France into Spain, descriptions of his journey and people he met, dinner, and of a club he visited. He paints a picture of an egalitarian society without racism, where people are friendly and happy. Quote, in Spain, as one can see at the dance that afternoon, there is no color line, and the Catalonian girls and their escorts mingled gaily with the colored guests, end quote. According to Michael Thurston, Hughes, quote, presents the example Spain can set for race relations before the bombs fall down and threaten to destroy it, end quote. This gayness is juxtaposed later in the article when that night Hughes experiences his first air raid. Hughes describes boom, the dull roar of dying vibration, and another boom, I saw through my window a flash of light, end quote. The snapshots of civilian life, the images of Madrid in the midst of the air raid, quote, humanizes the Spanish and invites readership with the reader, according to Thurston, quote, granting readers a stake in what is at stake in Spain, end quote. This humanizing gesture here, I read as a motif of peace journalism, turning attention to the lives of the people and giving voice to the historically marginalized. Like the poem Song of Spain, which, quote, adopts a global viewpoint and forges solidarity with the Spanish people, end quote, Hughes's dispatches in writing profiles about and conducting interviews with Black volunteers and recounting his experiences in Spain with the Spanish people conveys a political message that connects the fight in Spain with the fight against racism and tyranny everywhere, while bringing forward subjects who are participating in the work to reform and redefine society and what a positive peace would entail. As Anne Donlan's poetry, politics, and friendship in the Spanish Civil War points out, Hughes's solidarity with the workers in a global fight against fascism also sought to, quote, undermine the patriarchal structures ingrained in culture and politics, end quote. Three Guineas, with its framing question, quote, how in your opinion are we to prevent war, end quote, sounds an ethical call. Though Hughes cannot be considered an absolutist pacifist, he does write journalism and poetry that shares a language of peace, equality, social justice, economic reform, and freedom that is commensurate with the work necessary for answering that call. In revolutionary thinking, Woolf and Hughes stand together. Like Virginia Woolf, Hughes sees fascism as connected to tyranny and oppression everywhere. In closing his article, Milt Herndon died trying to rescue wounded pal, Hughes ponders, quote, I thought how Milton Herndon had died not only to save another comrade, another country, Spain, but for all of us in America as well. You see, he understood the connections between the enemy at home and the enemy in Spain. They are the same enemy, end quote. Woolf echoes this sentiment with the relation between English patriarchy and fascism, writing, quote, he is called in German and Italian for dictator, or duce, in our own language, tyrant or dictator, and behind him lie ruined houses and dead bodies, men, women, and children, end quote. While time and space do not allow me more extended examples of Hughes's peace journalism, nor do they allow me to discuss the way in which Hughes's critique of fascism and figuration of fascists as the enemy are in dialogue with the peace journalism from the Syrian civil war, I want to note that also central to Hughes's peace journalism is the spirit of hope and finding beauty amidst destruction. In Soldiers from Many Lands United in Spanish Fight, Hughes emphasizes the international and interracial cooperation. Quote, on one side of the Spanish government, there are also Germans, Italians, and Moors fighting for a new democracy, economic democracy, a different kind of soldier and a different kind of man, end quote. In Madrid's Flowers Hoist Blooms to Meet Raining Fascist Bombs, Hughes zeroes in on a moment of life in the midst of death. As I rode through the night now, increasingly loud with gunfire, I kept thinking about the flowers I had seen on the balcony railings of those empty and shell-torn houses. And I thought that perhaps those flowers might well symbolize the whole struggle in Spain, those flowers blooming so bravely there in the face of fascist fire, end quote. In the stillness of the flowers, Hughes gives us an image of peace. And like the flower in Picasso's Guernica, and Woolf's gesture towards the voice of the poets in Three Guineas, for the dream of peace, the dream of freedom, he gives us an image of hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. So we'll take about a minute and a half if you wanted to stretch, and then we will return and listen to Demet. But I should have asked in advance, am I actually pronouncing your name correctly? Is it Demet or Demet?
It's Demet.
Demet, okay, I realized Demet, yeah.
Thank you.
All right, why don't we get started? And our next presenter is Demet.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Oops, sorry. Do you see it all right?
We see just the entire presentation, so it's good. You're good.
All right. Thank you for joining. You can find my paper in the chat if you want to follow me from there. And I'm going to talk about Armenians in Virginia Woolf's ethics and aesthetics. I'll start. Modernity brought with it a novel experience, being a spectator of calamities taking place in another country. As Woolf would explain, this was an age when people were not fast anchored where they were and things were moving around them. People realized that the human life lasts but a second, that life is infinitely beautiful yet repulsive, that one's fellow creatures are adorable but disgusting, and that all bounds of union seem broken. The contradictory behavior of quote, locking one's doors and bolting the windows to ensure some privacy, end of quote, it being linked to others by wires that quote, speak about the battles and murders and strikes and revolutions, end of quote, all around the world, proved the images and sounds of wars were also experienced in living room. The quote, the awareness of suffering that accumulates in a select number of wars happening elsewhere, and the quote, shaped people's understanding of war and brought the breath of outside life into the cloister. But this also became a source of nightmare for the moderns. The visibility of other people's suffering increased. The distance of those sufferings or atrocities, however, intensified the sense of superiority. As Susan Sontag puts it, quote, central to modern expectations and modern ethical feeling was the conviction that war was an aberration, end of quote. Considering war as an aberration inevitably led to consider countries and people who suffered from that war inferior. The question of conveying the true reality preoccupied Woolf like the chimes of Big Ben in the background. She was worried about the forgetfulness of people near the end of the First World War and complained at first that, quote, people will soon forget all about the war, end of quote, and remember the First World War as a time of darkness and silence in which no one, including the combatants, knew what was going on or why they were involved. In an attempt to bear witness to that trauma, Woolf sought to convey the political reality of her society, and the Armenian issue was among the prominent political issues of the early 20th century Britain. Amid conflicting stories about the Armenian massacres, a dispute concerning the atrocities of the Ottoman Empire was waged between pro-Armenian MPs, such as James Bright, who publicly acknowledged his Armenian affinity, and pro-Turkish MPs. Despite Britain's positioning itself as an arbiter of international justice, British Empire's eastern politics were a matter of concern for pro-Turkish MPs, which led to Armenians being disappointed in regards of the help they were expecting from the British government. Virginia Woolf was also aware of the Armenian issue in Ottoman Turkey, and I argue that she had a profound sense of ethical responsibility towards people and satirized the political climate in Britain, although these views were overshadowed by her Europe-centered and Orientalist views. While considering the War Reparations Committee and the Civil War in Ireland, Woolf reflects on people's suffering. People go on being shot and hanged. The worst of it is the screen between our eyes and their gallows so thick. So easily one forgets it, or I do. Is it a proof of civilization to envisage suffering at a distance? Her questioning about how to approach war and other people's pain can be a guide to understanding the attitude of indifference as a form of political and ethical reaction, and what she writes about Armenians in her diary and in Mrs. Dalloway. Clarissa Dalloway is a medium to convey this dilemma for Woolf. Since she seemed to care much more for her roses than the Armenians, who were hunted out of existence, maimed, frozen, and were the victims of cruelty and injustice. She had heard Richard say so over and over again. No, she could feel nothing for the Albanians, or was it the Armenians? End of quote. Having heard her husband talk about the Armenians, the issue briefly occupies her mind while she is thinking about her roses. This brings the ethical dimension of Clarissa's daily life into contact with the global issues and underlines Clarissa's indifference to her ethical responsibilities. This narrative that links ethics and politics echoes Woolf's complaints about the forgetfulness of people after the First World War, as well as demonstrating exclusion and otherness at work. Although they were Christians, Armenians were an Eastern community mostly thought of as uncivilized and savage. In 1895, Alice Stone Blackwell, an American feminist and suffragist activist, wrote to Lord Bryce that she was translating Armenian literature into English with the help of American Armenians in order to overcome the great ignorance towards the Armenians. Quote, "We have found this useful in convincing people that the Armenians are not savages, but an intelligent and gifted race." End of quote. Blackwell's words refer to a particular mental and geographical gap, which emphasized the separation between the Oriental Armenians and the Western public. People needed to be convinced that Armenians deserved their sympathy. They were watching the suffering of people at a distance, a reassuring sign of their own civilization, since these events were not happening to them. This has a similarity with what Woolf wrote about the Irish people killed during the Civil War and manifests how hard it is to feel the pain when it is not one of yours who is dying or when it is not happening somewhere close to you. Although her reactions differed depending on the location and time of the war, Woolf's observation about people dying in Ireland doesn't mean that, like Clarissa, she was thoughtless and apathetic in her attitude towards such deaths. Quite the contrary, as seen in her diary entry where she wondered how her friend Janet Case could get so exercised over, quote, the quantities of Armenians. How can one mind whether they number 4,000 or 4 million, end of quote. She is aware of the attempt at ethnic cleansing and realizes that it doesn't matter whether 100 people or 4 million people died, but the motive behind those killings is what matters. While addressing the question whether to feel an ethical obligation to people with whom you have not much in common, Woolf also underscores the existence of a new modern subjectivity, a subjectivity divested of any human rights and exposed to the powers of savage social and public institutions bent on destroying a community. Clarissa's brief mention of Armenians can easily be missed or ignored in the narrative, but combined with the politics of the time, Woolf's comments on the Armenian issue foreground the question of ethical responsibility. Though Clarissa's indifference and disinterest and Woolf's comments about how she herself easily forgets about people killed makes her rather cold, this isn't for no reason. In modern culture, society was so influenced from war news from around the world, culminating with the First World War, that people had lost their contact with the reality. British society was kept aware of the Armenian massacres and the genocide through information gathered from British officials in Ottoman Turkey, from missionaries located in different parts of Asia Minor, and from the discourses of several MPs providing information for the government and the public. This was a substitute for reality. The growing discourse about the atrocities committed against Armenians by the Ottoman Turks and the reluctance of the British government to act in order to stop these atrocities created a sense of artificiality. The proliferation of discourses on the Armenian massacres and the genocide thus broke down the distinction between image and representation, and it masked the reality. People were now confronted with the procession of simulacra. The representation preceded and determined the real. The amount of war news coming from Asia Minor and places that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire created an artificial discourse which led people easily to forget or avoid criticism. And judging from the geographical location, people who were associated with war began to be considered as uncivilized, barbaric, and savage. Simon Gikandi argues that modernist artists and writers subsumed the primitive and barbaric as an appropriation of the other, and that modernism represents, quote, a positive form of ethnocentrism, what has come to be known as primitivism, end of quote. He also suggests, quote, if Africa didn't exist as the site in which the fears and energies of modernism could be projected, it would have been invented. Africa is the unconscious of the modernism, an absent cause, a force whose presence can neither be negated nor endorsed and must be repressed, end of quote. Woolf's conviction about the Ottoman Empire and communities and people living in the Orient can be read in the same way. Considering people suffering from war as uncivilized and inferior can also be a reflection of such an unconscious. Those are the people who represent otherness, and those are places onto which Woolf reflects the fear of her society, as she thinks that, quote, we are connected with this, that the whole world is a work of art, that we are part of this work of art. Hamlet or Beethoven quoted is the truth about this vast mass that we call the world. But there is no Shakespeare, there is no Beethoven. Certainly and emphatically, there is no God. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself, end of quote. If people are the thing itself and are the work of art itself, Woolf's web of narration reveals what they choose to forget, exclude, disparage about others, which points the truth about themselves. When Clarissa couldn't remember whether it was the Armenians or the Albanians who died, despite the fact that her husband was a member of a parliamentary committee on the Armenian question, she showed signs of losing connection with the reality, deeming herself superior and emphasizing the absence of ties between her and those people. Similarly, in Orlando's sexual transition takes place in Istanbul, where he works for the British government, and in Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa and Celestine share a kiss in Istanbul. These are other manifestations that Woolf's Africa is the Ottoman Empire, onto which she projects her fear of otherness and nonconformity. Representing the experiences considered as taboo in Istanbul, she associates it with abnormality and the marginal. Evaluated within the social and cultural background and as a reflection of the modernist unconscious, the sufferings of the Armenians remind her of her own nation's lack of civilization and communication and its failure in its duties to the others. In all these examples from her works, it is evident that there is an emphasis on indifference. A disengaged response to the existing political conditions can signal Woolf's ethical response to the politics of her time and is read as a form of political intervention by Jessica Berman. In Three Guineas, Woolf calls for women to maintain an attitude of indifference in order to, quote, take no share in patriotic demonstrations, end of quote, and to promote peace rather than war. Emphasizing the importance of forming a society of outsiders, Woolf creates a link between the idea of indifference and the ethics of authority. While the formation of the society of outsiders creates the possibility of being independent by ignoring existing epistemological conventions, it also underlines the importance of recognizing the other and otherness and the difficulty of knowing the other, which is reflected in another diary entry about a woman in London. There was a recklessness about her, much in the spirit of London, defiant, almost gay, clasping her dog as if for warmth. How many Junes has she sat there in the heart of London? How she came to be there, what scenes she can go through, I can't imagine. Oh, damn it all, I say, why can all know all that too, end of quote. Frustrated that she is not able to know more about the beggar woman, this lack of knowledge intensifies the mystery for Woolf. As Rachel Hollander maintains, this attempt to understand only exposes the impossibility of doing so, and it is a manifestation of a widespread and pervasive urban insecurity. Likewise, her comments on Armenians and Clarissa's indifferent attitude towards the Armenian genocide reflects a resistance to the politics of patriarchy. It also evokes the otherness of Armenians for Woolf, as her definition of other is Eurocentric and embodies colonial and Oriental discourses. In the same way as she fails to understand the beggar woman in London, and the mystery increases as she tries to do so, trying to understand the Armenian issue only increases Woolf's inability to understand the other, which is as a result transformed into a radically other. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Demet. That was wonderful. All right, our final presenter, Paulina.
Do we take a break after this
Oh,
presentation,
right.
or should I start
Sorry,
immediately?
sorry, I forgot.
No,
Great.
I'm fine.
Yeah, okay, so it's 11:40, so 11:41 and a half to 11:42. Okay, looks like we can get started again. So I'll wait till I see a few more screens come on. Paulina, it's just really good to see you. I hope you're doing well.
Thank you. I'm so glad to see you too here. Wonderful. Thank you. I will start sharing my screen if that's possible in the
Okay,
meantime. Okay, I will see whether it works. I hope so.
Yes, okay, wonderful.
Okay, thank you. So a year ago, I attended a conference on literary resistance. The keynote was delivered by a distinguished feminist scholar. The researcher warned the audience that in the current political climate, there is no point in reading Virginia Woolf. Instead, I heard, we should read texts that matter politically, particularly fundamentalist and extremist websites. I felt baffled as I thought about 7 political trials that I face, because I not only read fundamentalist websites, but also documented the spread of anti-LGBT local laws in Poland. And I recalled Woolf's words, to admit authorities into our libraries and let them tell us how to read, what to read, and value to place upon what we read is to destroy the spirit of freedom. End of quote. So, inspired by this eminent scholar, I decided to deepen my research on Woolf's early readers in Poland, people who buried themselves in her works during the 1930s, a period marked with the rise of totalitarian regimes and authoritarian states, the years that paved the way to the outbreak of the Second World War. Contributing to the recent scholarship on Woolf's early global reception and modernist publishing networks, this paper explores how Woolf was read and received by readers in interwar Poland, focusing on ethical aspects of her works. Chronology of Virginia Woolf reception in Poland resembles the triadic structure of The Lighthouse. The interwar promise of Woolf's work's journey to Poland was destroyed by the Second World War and fulfilled only after the end of the Stalinist regime at the end of 1950s. Though only excerpts from Woolf's F were translated in the 1930s, her avid readers demanded her novels and essays from reluctant publishers. In the interwar years, Woolf diverse audiences in Poland, ranging from literary scholars to critics, journalists to women writers, reviewed her works, wrote articles, gave lectures on her experimental techniques. Importantly, some of these early cultural mediators interpreted Woolf's experimental aesthetics as an ethical stance against patriarchal and totalitarian politics. To date, there are only 2 publications on Woolf's reception in interwar Poland. Kurowska from 1987 in Polish, and Derentowicz-Fotyga from 2002, the only English publication. Though they offer pioneering research, their scope, as you can see on the screen, is limited to several longer articles published in interwar newspapers. In my attempt to reconstruct Woolf's reception and the intertwined stories of her diverse readers in Poland, for the last 2 years, I was researching both digital and traditional collections of interwar newspapers. I found the writer's name in more than 95 texts that appeared in magazines and newspapers, including almost 60 articles. As you can see on the slide, I have divided the articles that include information on Woolf into 3 groups. Articles with primary focus on Woolf, as the one on the left, are extensive texts that offer a broad discussion of the writer's works. Articles with secondary focus in the middle are general texts frequently dealing with several writers that nonetheless offer a brief, in-depth discussion of Woolf works. And the last group of articles, like the one on the right, includes only some passing mentions of Woolf and her F. As you can see from this graph, the popularity of Virginia Woolf in interwar newspapers varied within the years, but there are certain factors that we can consider while looking at the general tendencies. So each rise in Woolf's popularity in the interwar period was a result of several factors, including, of course, new works published by the writer. We have several picks from Orlando, Flash in the years, translations into French and German and their reception on these literary marketplaces, socioeconomic situation, especially the late 1920s Great Crisis, Great Depression, and the strategies of Polish Jewish publishing houses that tried to promote and publish Woolf works among potential audiences in Poland. When we talk about diverse readers of Woolf in these years in Poland, we can think about 3 groups: scholars, women writers, and of course the most numerous one of critics and journalists. I would like to start with a few scholars who read Woolf in that period. Most probably the name Virginia Woolf first appeared in the Polish press in 1922. The writer, translator, and independent scholar Rakowska enumerated Woolf among outstanding British women writers, along Dorothy Richardson and Rebecca West. Rakowska's text was a review of the book The Modern English Novel, published in French by Abel Chevalier. By the way, the first, probably one of the first accounts of Woolf work outside Britain. A second reader, Roman Dubowski, was scholar, professor of English studies, who introduced Woolf as the post-impressionist writer and named her style a pointillist manner of writing after Seurat art. This analysis appeared in his 1920 book that was published in Czech Republic. In his much later 1939 text on post-war English literature, Dubowski used the term stream of consciousness for Woolf's experimental narrative techniques. The last person that I would like to discuss among scholars was Taranowski, a scholar, professor of English studies at Lviv University, who was so far absent figure in Woolf's reception studies, though as you can see in the slide, he was one of the most diligent and prolific critic of Woolf works in the interwar period. In the 1930s, he wrote, for example, extensive essay on Woolf titled Chasing Originality, Virginia Woolf Experimental Novels, in which he argued that Mrs. Dalloway and Orlando represent a new kind of fiction, the novel of consciousness. He reviewed most of Woolf novels and in brief notes informed the the readers about her essays, for example, about the publication of 3 guineas. Though it was highly unlikely, he survived the war and in 1946 became the head of English department in Krakow. Yet 2 months later, he was accused of conspiring against the communist state and died in Stalinist prison in 1951. Consequently, his extensive work, including translation of all Shakespeare's plays and publications on modernist fiction, was erased from Polish culture for decades. The next group of readers, of Woolf readers in Poland, were women writers, very responsive to her feminist message and to her attempts to create a fiction writing as a woman. First, Aniela Gruszecka, who was the first translator of Woolf works into Polish, publishing in her essay on modern novel substantial excerpts from Time Passes, the middle section of The Lighthouse. Hanna Skalbeck, a photographer and travel writer, immediately noticed how new modes of perception impacted on Woolf's artistic strategies. He wrote, for example, how brilliantly she captured, quote, inner cinematographic processes. The last person that I would like to present is Meltzer, a feminist writer and a poet, who in 1939 delivered a lecture titled Virginia Woolf and English Anti-Realism in the Polish Academy of Literature. It offered a poignant and fascinating coda to the story of Woolf's reception in interwar Poland. Meltzer presented the evolution of Woolf's novels, discussing most of her fiction. She focused on temporal aspects of her effort and praised the writer's ability of creating complex human psyche, particularly shifting emotional states. Yet, Meltzer criticized as well some portrayals of lower class, uneducated, impoverished characters as classist. The last but most numerous group of Woolf's readers comprises literary critics such as Świątek and Quidam and many anonymous journalists. As I have mentioned, importantly, some of these early cultural mediators interpreted Woolf's experimental aesthetics as an ethical stance against patriarchal and totalitarian politics. I would like to present now 2 case studies that focus on Woolf's ethics, one from texts by Gruszecka and second by Świątek. So Gruszecka, a novelist, critic, literary scholar, studied chemistry at the Sorbonne. She was fascinated by Virginia Woolf and worked on her own theory of experimental novel. In 1933, she published an essay that you can see on the screen, The Old and the New in the Contemporary Novel, using To the Lighthouse as a model example of original modernist fiction. Gruszecka was also the first translator of Woolf works into Polish, because in this essay, as I mentioned, she included the translation of Time Passes that was very popular and was circulated, for example, in French press, also in the translation. Gruszecka interprets Woolf's experimental technique and in-depth portrayal of psychological process as an ethical quest, inspired by, quote, personal identity of each human being and tireless sincerity towards all observable material that life brings. This novelist performed also a similar ethical quest in her own novel, An Adventure in an Unknown Country. So I would like to briefly present this novel as it performs a similar quest and offers also rich transtextual dialogues with Woolf works. The novel protagonist, Clara, is a designer of decorative tapestries that has been living in the shadow of her husband's and parents' deaths. She meets Julia, the wife of a doctor, with whom she experienced the Woolfian moment of being, transforming ordinary reality into an unknown country. For Clara, this turns out to be a breakthrough that ends her mourning and inspires her creativity, but also forces her to face the taboo of lesbian love. In the background, Gruszecka sketches the financial crisis of 1932, allowing the socialist Clara to fiercely criticize the society torn up by stratification and discrimination. At the end of the novel, Clara achieves a new understanding of her feelings for Julia, prompted by conversation with her brother, who leaves his partner when it turns out that due to the difficult labor, she is not able to have a sexual intercourse with him nor to bear a child. He explains that it would be for him a platonic relationship with a ghost, beyond the familiar or erotic bonds. Clara, shocked by his conduct, full of compassion for his partner, discovers that her love for Julia could be characterized in similar terms. Quote, "This is my meeting with Julia," she thought. She has seen it at a different angle and so clearly as never before, her attachment to Julia. Neither blood ties nor sex, one fundamental longing for seeing in her the reflection of her art. And this is not yet all. There is something beyond that to help her, to rescue her, because Julia seems to possess an unknown code that allows her to receive messages from the unknowable country of someone else's life and feelings. Clara's final discovery combines the central themes of the novel, a sapphic meeting through art and lesbian romantic love. The reference to unknown code brings to mind homosexual codes, while the motive of an unknown country denotes the awareness that another person as a separate and unique individual. A Woolf scholar reading the novel sees immediately transtextual relationship with Woolf works, particularly with the character of Lady Briscoe from To the Lighthouse, and possibly the motive Chloe likes Olivia from A Rooms of One's Own. The second reader who interpreted Woolf works from ethical perspective was Świątek, a critic, translator, and a pacifist. In the 1920s, he was also the artistic director of Słowacki Theatre in Krakow that you can see in the screen. In the 1930s, he published a series of articles on contemporary British writers, including Woolf and Joyce. During the Second World War, he was in France and protested, for example, against compulsory mobilization of his students. Little is known about his later life. In his article, titled New Forms of the Novel, Świątek referred to a variety of Woolf works, opening his text with a presentation of modern fiction as Woolf's artistic manifesto of, quote, impressionist psychology and the figure of Shakespeare's sister from A Room of One's Own. Then he offered a detailed analysis of novels from Night and Day to The Lighthouse or Land to Flash. He characterized Woolf as, quote, autonomous, independent, elegant, and sincerely democratic, focusing in his article on this last aspect. Though he sympathizes with Woolf's feminist stance in A Room of One's Own, Świątek perpetuates the myth of long-established inclusive British democracy, clearly unaware that the universal suffrage was introduced in the UK in 1928, 10 years later than in Poland, while the Reform Act of 1832, viewed as, of course, historic threshold in the development of democracy in Britain, extended the suffrage only to about 7% of adult population. More importantly, Świątek anticipates the criticism of the 1970s, when Woolf started to be regarded as a successful and impactful political writer, and not as, in Leonard Woolf's words, quote, the least political animal that has lived since Aristotle invented the definition. Świątek notes that Woolf's poetics, quote, constitutes an almost political statement in an increasingly hostile military cultures characterized by, quote, the fetish of collectivity, the crude cult of statehood, proclaiming the homogeneity of people and violation of human dignity, as the writer, quote, embraces everything that is different, eternally fluid, divinely elusive, and mutable in the human interior. In this reading, Woolf's embrace of protean elements becomes her form of both aesthetic and ethical resistance to the patriarchal and totalitarian politics. These two earlier interpretations of Woolf's interwoven aesthetic strategies and ethical stances are important if we take into consideration the attacks on Woolf and Bloomsbury faced in the late 1930s. The echoes of this criticism reached Poland in 1937 when Weintraub, then a critic writing under the pen name of Quidam, and later professor at Harvard University, translated into Polish Bosanquet Review of the Years from Time and Tide. It was published in Literary News. In Bosanquet Review, we may see that while both Gruszecka and Świątek saw Woolf's fascination with the individual prism as the basis of her ethical stance, and in case of Świątek, her anti-totalitarian resistance, some contemporaries may have interpreted it much less favorably, as in Bosanquet's hyperbolic phrase, quote, the attitude of callous Nero playing exquisite music, while the human race toils and starves, spirals investment and armaments, drills in gas mask, perishes in dark alleys. On the margin, it might be also observed how the contemporary eugenics theories are reflected in this review, as visible in the underlying extract, in which the postulates of eliminating causes of war and equal income are juxtaposed with the sterilization, quote, of the unfit. By using interwar scholarly and journalistic publication, this paper has focused on insights and promises of Woolf's mediated reception. However, such reception inevitably poses also some ethical perils. First, in the interwar publications, Woolf is frequently juxtaposed with other writers or portrayed as the leading voice of certain literary schools, which could be misleading. Secondly, there are mistakes and misrepresentation of the writer, especially in shorter text. To take a few striking examples, there is an article on Italian women journalists in which Woolf appears as one of the leading voices of the Fleet Street. There are obituary notes about Fort Maddox Fort, where allegedly Woolf made her literary debut in his English review. There is also an article in which Woolf is valued as a Jewish writer, differentiated from other talented yet only half-Jewish writers. However, the most important aspect of this heavily mediated reception is the loss of the writer's own voice, because the reception brought numerous articles, but only one translation. Consequently, the ability to read Woolf freely was still reserved for people who knew English or were able to read her in French and German translations. However, some early readers provided in their texts quotations, as did both Kruszewska and Świątek, offering the audiences in Poland access to Woolf's own words, of course, also in translation, but not only their interpretations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Paulina. Thank you, everybody. Those were three really wonderful and interesting papers.
I will stop sharing my screen in a second. I just need to switch it off. I'm sorry. Apologize. Oh, it should stop now.
Fine.
I hope.
We have a request to take a screenshot of us. So if I will give the floor over to Marielle for one moment. So if you wanted to turn.
Everybody could please turn on their camera if you haven't got a picture, and we'll just smile and take a picture for Twitter. Okay. Great, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So the floor is now open to questions from the audience, and so we can get started.
I guess I'll ask Ashley, what made you want to link together Woolf and Hughes?
I worked on a digital humanities project at Haverford College when I was doing my postdoc in 2015. And Hughes's journalism and poetry, Muriel Rukeyser's journalism and poetry, Pablo Picasso, the relief work in Spain, and Virginia Woolf were all central figures in that. And the students' projects made clear the interconnections in a very profound way. And I also find the generic breakdown of the journalism in the Spanish Civil War really very interesting. And then Charles Andrews put on my radar peace journalism. So just all of those things together have been parts of the book that I've been working on for a while.
Sounds fascinating.
It's been very fun. I mean, it keeps me awake at night.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Oh, I think it's definitely a good thing.
It seems, as far as journalism goes, that could even have been part of the title of the panel, because that seems to be a thread, whether or not we're looking at peace journalism or Woolf reading about the war or about the Armenian genocide at the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, knowing about it through, her friends, and then the journalism that is undertaken on Woolf. And of course, Woolf herself first made her living as a literary journalist. And I think about how, I don't know, maybe she started before then, maybe someone can correct me, but she read at least 3 newspapers a day through the 1930s. And so she was so tapped into the world around her. And it's just really important. And I think, Ashley, you must have really seen this in the digital humanities. I mean, just how present she was and tuned into everything that was going on. I'm always so sort of struck by that.
Well, and the other and more complicated answer to Marielle's question is that part of the work that the book project does is show the shared relationship of the language between journalism and experimental modernism and the aesthetics. And so I do cross readings of like Pablo Picasso and the newspaper print, and Woolf and the writer Louis Delapree, and Hughes and Ruckhiser are figured into that modernist aesthetic that's based on print journalism, but then they're also poets writing this print journalism. So I think there's an aesthetic relationship too. And that comes through in the scrapbooks of Three Guineas very clearly. So one of the things that the Digital Humanities Project did was to superimpose the images of the scrapbooks on Three Guineas onto the various pages of Three Guineas, the scanned pages, where the students could draw the connections and the relations. And so you could actually visually see the aesthetic relationship between the newspaper articles and Woolf's writing.
And just to, I'll stop after this, but then, but Paulina and I were among a team who worked on the Edinburgh collection. And Paulina, did we not see the extraordinary importance of literary journalism in promoting Woolf, and that the world of journalism sort of as the place where real criticism was done? And I think that's what you were really addressing here. And just I must say, I always love your PowerPoints, and I feel like maybe at another Woolf conference you could give a seminar on how you put them together. But anyway, they were all good. But yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, definitely. I think that the journalism, especially in the 1930s, actually managed to carry Woolf and her works to common readers, especially in the countries that were quite far from possibilities of reading her immediate translation, like, for example, that was the case in France, Germany, or Spain, but also, as we know, in Japan, for example, from the surprising very early points of her reception. So absolutely, I think that was a very important vehicle of the thoughts and also the spread of her feminist ideas then, because most of the essays were translated, especially feminist essays, were translated very late in Poland, for example, in the 1990s. But the information about, for example, the mixture of the pacifism and feminism in Three Guineas was already there in the 1930s, reaching Polish audiences. So I think that absolutely it's crucial. If I may have a question, I was thinking about Hughes' pageant about the striking coal miners, because once I was researching pageant, especially in the connection with Woolf, I was thinking about that maybe a surprising connection with Woolf works in the 1930s. So Ashley, has he ever managed to actually perform this pageant? Because I heard that there were difficulties at the beginning, especially it wasn't performed.
That's a fantastic question. I actually don't know. My scope with Hughes is pretty primarily Spanish Civil War.
Okay.
But that's super interesting. Thank you.
I also have a comment for Ashley, maybe, and perhaps a question developing from it. So I really loved your idea of pacifism as a continuum. and that close reading of war must be stopped at all costs. And then in the Daughters of the Educated Men version is war must be stopped without the at all costs. So I was wondering how that connects to what you pointed out at the end, that reflection that Woolf has about what she calls in Thoughts on Peace in an Air Raid, our inner Hitlerism. But in Three Guineas, she just compares the dictator, they call him dictator in Germany or Il Duce in Italy, but it's the same at home. I think she calls it an egg in Three Guineas, right? So I wanted to ask you what you think about how these two things fit together. So basically, if the idea that, like, to kind of try to describe the continuum. So I'm wondering if the idea that war must be stopped, but not at all costs, not at the cost of more war, is kind of related to the idea that we must look at peace with the eyes of war as well, and see the dictators and the Hitlers and the Mussolinis in our own society, because they are the patriarchs, the supporters of patriarchy. So yeah, I just wanted you to basically play more with this idea of the continuum, of pacifism as a continuum, and how one should be critical of peaceful institutions in order to prevent them from leading to war.
Thank you so much, Laura. Actually, I really wanted to go there with the idea of the inner Hitlerism and the way that we're all implicated, especially in the photographs, and that, we're silhouetted behind the photographs along with the dictator and the tyrant, and that there's not this division. Of course, I ran out of time and space, but thank you for asking that question, because now I get to think about it a little bit more. So the pacifism as a continuum is from Dwayne Caddy, and he actually writes about how pacifism and warism are actually not differences in scale or in kind, but they're differences in degree. And so he asserts that warism is the basis of our current society right now, and he uses this term warism. And that pacifism is along the same continuum, and his close reading shows how the notion of just war allows for those gradations to kind of float in between, that very few people are, if any, are absolutist pacifists in the way that we like to think about absolutist pacifism, and very few people are as militant as, like, let's say, the futurists, right? That most people fall somewhere on this degree, and that if you're sliding more towards figuring yourself as a supporter of peace, then you're more towards the pacifist end of the spectrum, right? So it takes away these incredible binaries that people like to talk about with war and peace. Now, that is kind of one set of logics, and part of the complication of the paper and the book project is that I take like so many different logics and I'll mush them together. So there's the pacifism on a continuum logic, and then there's the entire peace as a process logic. And you can think about utopian studies as a model for this, which is that utopian studies can be seen as a creative strategy. Instead of, we're going to get to utopia, have this kind of static moment of perfection, and then live there forever, right? Like that, in a lot of utopian theorists' views, isn't possible. That the minute that you start to create utopia, you're going to have a dystopia that shadows it. And so one of the things that I'm trying to work with is taking this logic and applying it to the idea of peace and peace theories, that we can view pacifism and peace as a creative process. In that viewing, there's two different kind of huge ways, to be too reductive, of getting there. One is the superstructure, which would be a Marxist way, like you fit fix everything wrong with the structures of society and you wind up with the better people. The other is very Gandhian, which is you fix your inner self and then you wind up with a better society, right? So one focuses on the individual, one focuses on the superstructure. I think Woolf is in vacillation between these two. And I think that's where our own complicity comes in. And that where we need to understand that we are contributing to this culture very actively, and that it's not an issue, it is an issue of patriarchy, but that patriarchy isn't only an issue of male dominance, that some women are patriarchs also, and that we really have to, you know, excavate those things from ourselves. And so I think that the continuum approach allows us to contend also with the idea that there's a difference between violence and war. And a lot of peace theorists or a lot of people who talk about pacifism conflate that, you know, you can have an individual instance of violence, but that's not the political discussion of war. And so that can be also seen as individual versus systemic or individual versus global. So I don't know if that helps to clarify any of what you were asking, but those are just the thoughts that came to mind, and I'll stop there.
Actually, Ashley, quick question. Who's the one who came up with warism and the spectrum name?
Dwayne Katie.
Dwayne.
I'll put his name in the side chat
Thank you.
here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I go back to, thank you, that was really helpful. Paola, you had a question or a comment, but I wondered if it might be something that Demet might want to respond to, or any one of the panelists. I'll put it back in the chat. Here, let me. This
Is it about the Ukrainian one?
Yeah, I just put it back in the chat. That's from Paola.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because when I was writing the paper, I kept thinking about it. You know, yeah, when the comments and what they think about the Armenian genocide and how, you know, it belongs to a different part of the world, and that's why it, you know, it needs to prove that you know, it deserves sympathy from the people from other places in the world. Kept me remind, you know, it brought to mind about the Syrians and what happened to the Syrians and the world's reaction to the Syrians and their death. And in contradiction to that was, you know, everything about the Ukrainians and how in most of European channels, you know, and news, the journalists kept telling that this is in Europe, this is happening to people like us. So it is really sad to hear that. It's quite, you know, demarcating, you know, drawing borders between the sufferings of people, and you need to belong to some part of the world in order to, you know, other people to condemn what happened to you. So yeah, it really resonates with what Woolf said about, you know, Irish people. I think she is quite honest, although what she writes about Irish people being killed in the Civil War and how she easily forgets about those deaths. This sounds really harsh and cold, but I believe that it's really honest. And I think that most of people, they think this, or, you know, behave in the same manner. We watch the news, we hear the death and destruction in, you know, different parts of the world, but we forget after we, you know, turn the TV off. And this is what Woolf is saying. And in that sense, it's quite, you know, illuminating for me.
Can I just make a comment too? Thank you so much for that. I was also struck by the beginning of Paulina's presentation about the Polish readers who turned to Woolf between the wars. And I think about how so many people one can see on the Woolf listserv and in the salons who say they turn to Woolf, and how she becomes such a go-to point. I know Judith Allen has written a lot about that, but how kind of in so many parts of the world we say, all right, I don't want to, there's that horrible book, What Would Virginia Woolf Do? And Paula Maggio has written in her blog about that. But I mean, I find that Woolf, it's interesting, Paulina, how you said that, Polish readers were turning to Woolf during this tenuous time.
Yes, absolutely. It seems that every epoch has her Woolf and new readers that discovers her. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I guess someone is raising a hand.
Jeanne to go. Still muted.
Hi, Paulina. It's really good to see you again. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question for that. Could you tell us a bit more about where feminism was in Poland between the wars? Because, you were talking about how lots of women writers responded to her feminism, and, what made Woolf particular go to? Was there something particular happening then that they were turning to Woolf at that time?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question and for your presence here. It's wonderful. Absolutely. The development of feminism in Poland was very much closely intertwined with the movement for independence. So many women who were closely connected with the work for independence that was reached in 1918 were still in the feminist movement in the early 1920s. Thanks to that situation, for example, we have this universal suffrage in Poland in 1919. So all women are, along with men, allowed to vote, while of course, in Great Britain, we need to still wait for that till 1928 at least. So there is huge development in the interwar period of the feminist thought. Most often it originates with the 19th century Polish feminist thought. So doesn't necessarily situates British or even French or German feminist thoughts as their sources, because there are so many already there. And also there are many voices of the early female politicians, early women activists who were actually very much struggling for the same rights at the universities, in terms of the marriage as well. So in many ways, it was much, I would say, developed at that time than in Britain. Of course, unfortunately, because of the Second World War, because of the communist regime later, the situation was completely reversed in many ways. But the situation was that I think we would have many women audiences then in Poland very much interested in this feminist aspects of her work, rather than this quite challenging modernist aesthetics that she was praised for by the especially scholarly readers. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And if I could ask a follow-up question, if I've got a question for Demet as well, if that's okay. I was interested in the figure of the beggar woman that you ended with, which you came from the diary, but I just wondered if you thought about the connection, because you were talking about Mrs. Dalloway, the connection with the beggar woman in Mrs. Dalloway. I know it's quite a few years earlier, the diary quotation you left us with, but is there some sort of connection?
Yeah, I guess there's a beggar woman in the park, and Peter Walsh and other people see, and he gives money to her. I guess she wrote that part, influence from the beggar woman she took notes about in her diary. Yeah, and she that part in the novel also reflects her thoughts in the diary. That woman represents the fact that she cannot know about every person in the city, and there are some connections that she is losing, although in Mrs. Dalloway she's trying to connect people, through associations and through the places they are. So there are some missing parts, and that's missing, that lack is there because, you know, those people are other, or those people are the people that she cannot associate, or she cannot identify, or she cannot understand completely. And that lack turns them into radical others, because, you know, so it gets even difficult, even more difficult to understand those people. And I think that's the connection between the diary entry and the part in Mrs. Dalloway.
Yeah, thank you. I agree, because she's some sort of strange primordial force, isn't she? She's almost non-human.
Yeah.
Mrs. Dalloway. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Speaking of the beggar woman, do you think she kind of might function as not quite human, as a kind of chorus, kind of mourning? I don't know if that's too strong of a connection. Mourning, you know, the suffering that Mrs. Dalloway certainly, that is certainly present throughout, but I never thought about but I want to go back to that figure of the beggar woman. In my paper, I'd referred to this short essay by David Galeff, who wrote about Woolf's miniatures, and that got me really in what he calls her miniatures, and that just makes me want to kind of go back to all of her work and look for the miniatures and pay a lot more attention to that, because like the rest of us, we kind of walk by and don't pay attention. And of course, that's the big beauty of Mrs. Dalloway, is getting readers to pay attention. And so, Demet, like Jane, I really liked the way you talked about the beggar woman in Mrs. Dalloway. But I hadn't thought about that connection between that and the Armenians.
Yeah, I guess what is aesthetically good about Mrs. Dalloway is how she puts some details which can easily be ignored by the reader or not recognized at all. But those details are really important, like the Armenian one, because, you know, she is satirizing Clarissa's class and politics, because in her party the prime minister is there, and every, you know, MPs are there, and all, you know, people who are connected with the politics of British society are there. So her party represents a certain class in British society, and she is criticizing those people who are producing the politics and who are being indifferent or disinterested about sufferings of other people. So what I am saying is that the beggar woman is another representation of such a take, I guess, such an understanding, because it is another reality of the society, and we just miss it, and we just, you know, pass by and don't, you know, give a damn, or, you know, we don't think about those people, but those details generate the society in a way. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, it had to have been hard to have been Woolf to pay so much attention to everything. I think that she was just constantly paying attention. Maybe being sick was her holiday from having to be so completely tapped into the world around her.
Yeah, and that's what I like about Woolf, because I can see her, you know, changing, you know, her change in her works. I mean, her first works and the last works are, you know, different from each other, and what she says, you can see her development. That's why what she criticizes, there's a vagueness or ambivalence maybe in Mrs. Dalloway, but she harshly criticizes that in Three Guineas. And that shows me a kind of personal development, or some maybe certainty, some things get, you know, some clarity maybe about her thoughts, or about how to connect politics and with her her work art. So yeah, that's what I like about Woolf, and every time I read her, I find something important, a different thing that I haven't recognized before. So that's why it's, you know, an ending work for me.
time for one short question. Well, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I'm going to be, my head will be swimming as it has been since the conference. This was so wonderful. So another round of applause for our panelists, and look forward to seeing you later in the day. All right. Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Before we all leave, I just wanted to remind that today's long break / lunch is only 45 minutes instead of an hour, and the plenary starts at 1:15. So don't be expecting an hour and then missing out on that great presentation.
No intention. Thank you. Thanks for that
Thank
reminder.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for wonderful sharing, Jean. Goodbye.
I just want to see you. You know, I was actually, I had this grant to go to
Uh-huh.
Turkey, and I thought,
know.
oh, maybe I can stop by in Poland, and my school wouldn't let me. They said it was too
Oh.
close, and I thought, oh, I
What a
was so
pity.
disappointed. Yeah,
You are
yeah.
always so welcome. So
Oh,
I hope
thank
that there will
you.
be a chance. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
See you
Anyway, I've
around,
been
I hope.
thinking of you, but
Thinking of
they
you.
won't
Goodbye.
let anyone go there. So yeah. All
Thank
right.
you.
So good
Goodbye.
to see you. Bye. Bye. Okay. All right.